Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending where you are in the world. Today we have people from companies, law firms, regulators, civil society in all continents watching this session. Welcome everyone to Shining a Light on Dark Patterns. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Meta, the artist formerly known as Facebook, for sponsoring today's session. Of course, welcome to our speakers, Dr. Jennifer King, Dr. Dan Hayden, Jane Hunt and Finn Mirestad, and I will give a little more detail about our speakers shortly. I first will introduce myself. I'm Stuart Drezner, founder and chief executive of Privacy Laws and Business. We're the world's most experienced company in this specific area, information on privacy laws. And with this month, we're celebrating our 35th anniversary. So it's a sort of a way to celebrate. This party celebrates our 35 years of activity. So thank you for joining us today, and particularly those, of course, and those who subscribe to our international UK reports published in alternate months in online, PDF and paper formats. For details, visit our website, privacylaws.com. And I know that thousands of you download our news and podcasts, and all that information is available on our website. First of all, I'm going to introduce our speakers in a little more detail, then go on to the subjects, and then hand over to the panel. So first of all, our moderator is Professor Dr. Jennifer King, and you're the moderator for this session. You're a Privacy and Data Policy Fellow at Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence in California. So hello. And the panel members, Dr. Dan Hayden, Director of Data Strategy at Meta, and your co-lead of TTC Labs, which is a design lab in Dublin, focused on improving user experiences around personal data. And now we've got Jane Hunt, your senior legal counsel at Amadeus, and you'll explain more about that shortly, who is you legally qualified and practice law in the UK, but you currently work in Spain, where you're speaking from now. And last but not least, Finn Mirestad, you're head of the digital services section at the Norwegian Consumer Council. And you achieved prominence in leading research and campaigns against the practices of major companies in the collection and use of personal data in consumer products and services. So we're talking now about both this dark patterns is both a consumer and data protection issue. And last year, you gave evidence to a hearing of the United States Federal Trade Commission on dark patterns. So this subject is at the center of your interests. Now, turning to today's subject, I will take as a starting point this image you see before you, which we selected for this event. It's a semi-fictional consent form. It shows absurd consent options with a virtually invisible opt-out grey letters in the bottom left-hand corner, which obviously most people would miss. So, as I said, it's both a privacy and a consumer issue. This session, we will cover many of the following questions. How should dark patterns be defined? 2, how should consent for an action, such as the collection of personal data or a route through an app or a website, be obtained fairly and lawfully? 3, at what point does user experience design become manipulative? 4, how does an organization get direction from top management to balance commercial gains against winning its users' trust and keeping it? 5, how can an organization most effectively secure its reputation for fairness? And 6, what is the role for regulation? The European Union is currently finalizing the Digital Services Act. The European Parliament has approved recently provisions on prohibiting deceptive and nudging techniques to influence users' behavior through dark patterns, such as using colors and design to push users towards specific consent options and repeatedly asking for consent for the sharing of personal data with a company. It's not only Europe. In the United States, we have the influential California Consumer Privacy Act, and it states that, quotes, agreement obtained through use of dark patterns does not constitute consent. Of course, that leads to what's it meaning of dark patterns, which we'll go into. So to guide us through this subject, we have our panel. If you have any questions for the speakers, please type them into the Q&A section, which you'll find at the right of your screen. That's the Q&A section, not the chat. We want to just focus on the Q&A section. Type in the questions when you think of them, although the plan is to take questions after the presentations. A recording of the video of this session will be available to you after the session. Now, over to you, Professor Jennifer King, who will introduce the subject.
Good morning, everybody from California, where the sun is just starting to come up. So I'm going to start us off by giving a very quick overview of dark patterns, sort of a level set, so that we can all start off at least on the same page in case you've come to this talk today wondering exactly what dark patterns are. So let me start first with this question: what is a design pattern? So design pattern is basically a building block that designers use to build different interfaces, whether that's a mobile application, a web page. And you can think of it, I think, like this. If you were building a house, you need a door, obviously. You could build your own door. You could start from scratch, but for the most part, you're probably going to pick a pre-existing object, a well-designed door for your home or for your office or whatever you're building. And so design patterns are a lot like that. They're these reusable components that have emerged over time, whether that's through academics like me who've done research on them, or just from practitioners who have put these different types of patterns in front of thousands and thousands and sometimes millions of people to get a sense of which things work well, so that you don't always start from scratch. You can use radio buttons, you can use toggle buttons, you can use drop-down menus. These are all different components that designers use to build web pages. So they're there to really help us build these things consistently. Now, dark pattern is specifically another type of web component that we find manipulates, deceives, coerces people towards taking actions that don't necessarily directly benefit them, but benefit the designer, or in this case, the company. We'll use the words designer and company often interchangeably because, for the most part, while designers implement these things and build them, usually it's not their individual motive to implement dark patterns. It's something they're doing on behalf of a company. And so what we see here, the example on this page is actually taken from a company where if you want to cancel your subscription, instead of being able to just simply click a button to cancel, you have to actually call the company or chat with an agent online in order to make that decision. And no surprise, what will happen when you do that is you'll probably get persuaded or talked out of ending your subscription. So this is actually a common example that we see in the dark pattern space, where companies make it very easy to sign up for things, but then much harder, many more steps if you want to cancel, end a subscription, what have you. Okay, so where do we find dark patterns? So today, if you've encountered them yourself in the wild, as it might be, it's mostly been in the e-commerce and online shopping space, but also in terms of privacy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Areas where you're consenting to disclose information, or you're just deciding to engage in some type of information disclosure. Another area that we won't spend much time on today are what we call kind of attention dark patterns. This area of gaming, online games, even gambling, things that you find either engage you, waste your time, make it very hard to quit. That's another type of dark pattern as well. And the thing that we often see is that we find dark patterns at what I call decision points. So these places where you have to actually make a choice or a decision. That's normally where you're finding them, because that's where somebody wants to persuade you or push you towards a decision that favors them over potentially your own autonomous decision and what you may want. Okay. Very quickly, how do they work? For the most part, they are relying on what we call heuristics and cognitive biases. Okay, so these are basically either shortcuts in the way humans think, or they are what we call kind of inherent biases to how humans think. The sense is that these are generally universal, that humans around the globe tend to have the same types of heuristics and biases that they rely on. But essentially, it's a situation where you need to make a choice, and you're going to try to work quickly with what information is in front of you, rather than being able to kind of stop, take it slowly, and think through things. As you probably know for your own experiences of being online, using mobile apps, you're often not in a space where you can stop and, let's say, read the privacy policy or read the terms and conditions from start to finish. So instead, you tend to rely on shortcuts to make these decisions, and that's where dark patterns come in. They take advantage of both your propensity to rely on those things and often the time pressure that you may be under when you're actually trying to make these decisions. Okay, so I'm going to go through just a few different types and then we'll get into our panel discussion, just so everybody kind of sees a few examples and tries to understand what we're talking about. So this category here is what we call deceptive, meaning they're trying to mislead you, plant false beliefs. And so these are all examples of false urgency. And so you often see these in e-commerce situations where there's basically time pressure being put upon you to make a decision. So the first one, and I apologize if you can't see these very closely, hopefully you can, you know, there's words on here saying it's a temporary offer, there are only 2 left. The one in the middle is trying to encourage you to make a decision. 8 other people have looked at this in the last 10 minutes. And then the final one, which is in fact a shopping bag made out of stone. I just have to note that. That does cost $11,500 in the US. You know, they're telling you 10 people are viewing this right now. So the idea is to give you a sense of like, I need to do this because I might lose whatever it is I'm looking at. Often when we take these websites apart and look at the code, these timers are false. They aren't necessarily connected to anything. In some cases they may be, in some cases this website might actually only have 3 of something left. But often we see things, especially timer countdowns, they're not actually connected to anything, and it is truly deceptive. Another one that many of us are probably also accustomed to at this point is what we call guilt shaming or confirm shaming. And this is where you're being made to feel guilty when you're making a choice, usually unsubscribing to something that the company doesn't want you to do. The top example, you can turn off the ad blocker or click the link that says, I am a bad person. Maybe harder to see in the one below that. But this is one from our new California law. If you want to execute your do not sell my personal information choice, you're told this action will make it harder for us to tailor content to you. You know, just a little jab to kind of make you feel like you're missing out on something. My other favorite ones here for the Weather Network, they tell you the Weather Network helps save lives. Therefore, you should allow the app to track you rather than execute your choice to say, no, I don't want it to. So these are pretty common, and I would assume most of us have probably seen some of these at this point. And then just a couple here quick on privacy. Of course, if I'm talking to an audience across Europe, you are all very, very, very familiar with cookie consents, and you probably noticed how those have changed over time. The blue example on this page, I think, is probably what you would have seen several years ago in terms of there's a notice, you can hit accept, you have no other choice other than to close the website and walk away. There's an example here on this page from the California law where there's a toggle button that can slide. In this view, it's blue, but often these things are unlabeled and you can't actually tell if you're agreeing to allow yourself to be tracked through cookies or you're disagreeing. And often you have to try to read that very long text to try to understand what the button is implying. And then finally, here's another kind of both privacy and guilt shaming example at the bottom where you're asked if can you continue to tailor ads for you. You're only given one choice. Yes, if I'm going to use this app, I'm going to let you show me relevant ads. Okay, this is the last page, and just very quickly, I bring up bundled consent as more provocatively, because this to me is actually a question that we could talk about today, whether bundled consent itself is a dark pattern. And by bundled consent, I mean the idea that when you sign up for a service, you click a single button and that it accepts the privacy policy, the terms of service, and kind of anything else the company wants to attach to that button. This is very standard in the US. I think there are good questions as to whether or not this should be the case in the EU under the GDPR. However, I think it's a provocative one only because we know that people don't read privacy policies. We know they don't read terms of service conditions. And so unbundling these things and forcing people to go through every single one isn't necessarily an improvement. And so this is a type of dark pattern that I think just raises some interesting questions around what we might actually do to improve people's experiences, make sure they actually are engaged in informed consent, but don't necessarily have to bundle this all together in a way that makes it as easy as possible to sign up and not deal with those things. And with that, I am done with my slides. And Stuart, do we have any quick questions before we move on from the audience?
There is a question there, but I think you want to get going with the panel because there's some of these points may be answered as you go through.
Got it. All right. So before actually I go into any specific questions, I just want to ask the panel group, was there anything actually you would add to what I just went over? I know I didn't go through exhaustively every dark pattern, but is there anything in particular you think you'd like to just chime in on before we move on? No? Dan? Jane? All right, let's go. Okay, so my first question is to Finn. Finn, dark patterns are really having their moment. This is a topic that you and I know, have been discussing both personally and on various public stages a lot over the last year. And I'm just curious why you think this is. As an academic, it seems to me they become much more pervasive, but it doesn't necessarily explain the whole story. So can you give me kind of your take on why suddenly are we talking about dark patterns and seeing them literally everywhere?
A good question. And no, I think it's I think you touched the button there. I mean, it's becoming more prevalent. That's one thing. But also there's become much more public scrutiny. I mean, if you go on Reddit, there are several subthreads documenting daily different dark patterns. There's much more research in the field, and excellent research by yourself, but also by many other scholars around the world, using well-known, analyzing this from a user perspective, from a psychological perspective, behavioral economic perspective. And this discussion has made us much more aware of the fact that we're being manipulated by these dark patterns. So I think that's one element. And I think once you manage to put a word on it, dark patterns is maybe not the best word, but it's a word. You can also call it manipulative designs. You can call it deceptive designs. Many things you can call them. People become more aware of them. At least I was. The second I heard about this term and heard about what it was, I started seeing them everywhere. And people get annoyed when they find out that this has happened to them. They feel manipulated. They can feel it's unfair. Sometimes you feel stupid because you fell for it. But I mean, that's why they're there. They are there to basically make us push us into making decisions that we otherwise probably wouldn't want to do. And it has impacts on our integrity, our autonomy, even our freedom of thought, I would say, in certain extents, when a certain, let's say in the privacy field, when very personal information, for example, is being gathered about you against your own will. That could be, for example, location data that you give up without even knowing it, or you feel forced to give it up. And location data, for example, can be used for many purposes. It could be used to analyze your lifestyle. You can also find out whether someone believes in a certain religion, where they go to church or synagogue, where their sexual orientation, and so on. So many things can be deducted from that, and it really undermines user agency and autonomy. So that's something that we're really, really worried about. And at the societal level, we also believe that over time it reduces trust in digital services, which I think is quite unfortunate, because there are many digital services that are, very useful, helpful, and actually necessary to participate in society. And we also believe it adds to the sort of chilling effect that we've seen in the last years, following all the privacy scandals that we've had, that people are afraid of using online services. So, for example. So these are very important issues. I'm really glad that we're having this discussion today and see how we can sort of map out a way forward.
Thank you. Jane, I'd like to turn to you next. So I'm going to ask you a question specifically about the sector you work in. And so before you answer, I hope you'll take a second to describe what Amadeus does and how that relates to this. But I will say one of the things I have observed is that dark patterns tend to take over entire industries. You work in travel. Travel is one, from a consumer's perspective, that I have certainly seen dark patterns become very ubiquitous. Suddenly you look around and every rental site, every hotel is engaged in some form of this. And so can you just share with us, again, a little bit more background about what Amadeus does, but also your perspective on why you see these types of things begin to take over entire sectors, at least speaking for the one that you work in.
No, completely. So most of you will never have even heard of Amadeus. Amadeus is a travel technology company, basically. It is the back end providing technology solutions to a lot of the travel industry, both airlines, hotels, travel agencies, etc. It grew from before the other social media companies had even been thought of, I think, as a computer reservation system, basically. So it was the first platform, really, to connect travel agencies with airlines to be able to sell tickets what we call indirect bookings. Now it is much more than that. That is what we call the computer reservation system, but now it offers lots of travel technology services, including connecting our customers to the social media platforms for ad campaigns and the like, as well as providing the digital media for our customers directly. So in that case, I suppose a designer part. So what was so exciting when I was asked to join this was we are not the consumer, but we are the business interface with a lot of this, sometimes doing it ourselves and sometimes other people. And you're absolutely right, dark patterns happen and they're ubiquitous everywhere. And different people want different things, which is a very difficult thing for us. So the big issues that we face is that trying to explain how these work. Do you know what I mean? What our customers usually want is, I want to sell my product in a certain way. Can you explain to me how this will work? So what we're missing really is kind of transparency and standardization. And we also have historically a very interesting comparator to that, because when the first computer reservation system was built by the airlines to distribute tickets, there was regulation in place to decide how that information must be displayed, so that everybody was working off a similar information. So everybody had the same thing to be able to compare to. So there was standardization. And so one of the big difficulties for us now is, as soon as you're working in the unregulated market and there is no standardization either imposed by regulators or agreed between all of us, it's very difficult to compare one matter with another, one product with another, when you're saying, yes, let's connect to this, or let's design our website like this. And that lack of standardization, I suppose, creates a problem with trust. And I think Finn made the excellent point of nobody's saying we can't use digital media. You know, we can't do that. We all want to do it because it is so valuable from a business perspective and it's valuable for the end consumer. But it's doing in a trusted manner, which is what we want ultimately to be able to say is, we want to provide these services to our customers and we want to be able to explain how they work so that they can trust them, because we want to link up with people we trust.
Thank you for that.
Does that answer your question, Jennifer? In a long way.
Yes, and I think it also highlights the extent to which consumers are in kind of the same boat, in the sense that if you want to be in the e-commerce context, if you want to compare things, if you are increasingly in a bubble where everything is personalized to you, it becomes very hard to have this sense of what is kind of the objective reality and what is a price compared to a price here and a price there and a price there. So I think that raises a really core issue. Dan, I'd like to turn to you next. So can you just describe, from your foothold at Meta, obviously a large platform, kind of what challenges you see facing the business or facing what you do with dark patterns? In particular, I'm kind of curious about, I guess, the ambiguity in trying to decide what is a dark pattern and kind of where the challenges are for you right now.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, I think I would describe it as like a good challenge and a tough challenge, because I think what's really useful about the kind of concept of dark patterns is that it raises the bar for good design. And that like broadly, that's good for the industry, right? Like these are the interfaces we have with consumers, the relationships we have that reflect like trust, the respect we have for people who use our services. And I think what we've seen is, like, over a number of years, if you think of like interfaces, even like 5 or 10 years ago, they were quite different. They were much less accessible. I think the shift to mobile made things like clearer, simpler, faster to use. And it's broadly raised the bar and people's expectations for how they should be able to, consume media online, interact, make decisions, get clear information, and as well as brought light, I think, to lots of like the potential risks and harms that come with that. And I give a lot of credit to Finn and the team at Norwegian Consumer Council who wrote the big report around this that kind of, I think, brought the idea of dark patterns to light for a lot of privacy people. But for me, what they did was give a term to a frustration a lot of people felt, which is like, how do you actually reconcile not just like giving people like legal terminology or giving them decisions like nominally, but like really making it accessible and easy to use for people as well, and reflecting like the best standards in how we do that. And I don't want to bury the lead and say that it's all a question of like good design and bad design, because there's also like good and bad intent, right? And good and bad practices. But it's also true that sometimes bad design can be indistinguishable from dark patterns. And sometimes companies have inadvertently invented dark patterns, or they'll have practices that stand for years. And I think what you described of like some industries have specific kinds of problems that are pervasive, like things like subscriptions that persist. That might stand from, you know, a time when you actually had to go to a gym to unsubscribe because that's where they had the computer with the list. But it persists over time. And I think what is useful is describing that term and saying these are the range of bad practices. The tough thing about that, though, just as you said, that these are becoming more pervasive, is that I think when I first started looking at this area, even like say 6 or 7 years ago, it was actually relatively easy to understand what a dark pattern was. And there's a designer called Harry Brignall who kind of brought the term to light and coined it as such. And you could look at what the dark patterns were that were on darkpatterns.org, and it was things like you tried to get rid of an ad and the little X would move or it'd be like really tiny. It was really obvious what a dark pattern was, and it was really easy, I think, for a designer to avoid implementing something like that. You had to really intentionally say, I'm going to subvert the intent of the user. I think now we're in a space that's much more nuanced, and I think similarly we're using the dark pattern term to reflect quite a wide range of different kind of like consumer protection issues, and also a range of issues around like marketing, around how companies make commercial properties, around how they design their storefronts. That is very, very broad. Like that is really actually quite a big job, because I think wherever you look, you can start saying, how might this be considered? How could we design that better? How clear could we make things? And I think like raising that bar is very helpful, but we also have to make the problem tractable. And I think for those of us who are working within companies and trying to avoid any kind of experience that might be considered a dark pattern, it can be quite difficult to say your design should reflect the context. It should balance kind of informing people and giving them clear choices. It should fit in a mobile screen. It should provide all the important information. And by the way, people really don't have a lot of time they want to spend on this stuff sometimes. And that's true across both like their shopping basket. It's also true sometimes in decisions they make about data. And that's not, I mean, that's not like something that we just kind of brush over and say that's just how it is, right? The job is to help make people informed, but it's also a factor. It's like gravity, you know. People have a sense of urgency around the things they're trying to do online. So for me, it's both a very useful concept. I think we need to put shape on it. I think it's helpful to define what the kind of practices are. I think we need to get into the business of like trying to tell people, you know, what they need to avoid. What does coercion look like online? What does manipulation look like online? What are the right bounds of this is a fair commercial kind of offering and what you can do, and what isn't? But some of that also means not trying to take every kind of issue on at the same time and continually expanding the scope. Or maybe that is what dark patterns becomes. It becomes like consumer protection online. But I do worry it'll become less easy to respond to it in full if that's the case.
Yeah, you raise a couple of good points that I want to just reflect on before we switch topics, which is, bad business practices existed before the internet, obviously. And when I first started working in this space, which has already been a decade, the types of things I was seeing were dark patterns that were the business model. And so if you took the dark pattern away, the business collapsed. And so, you know, in this case, we're talking about what I would call particularly egregious schemes, essentially, you know, to part you with your money. And so as soon as you resolve the dark pattern, suddenly there literally is no business model. The business will go under. And I think those still probably exist, very much so, at the maybe at the edges of kind of the consumer experience and maybe necessarily right in the forefront. But it has gotten a little bit harder, I think, because they've turned into something that complements the business model, perhaps tries to give you an edge, but isn't necessarily something that will make the business fall apart. And so in that sense, they're a little bit more ambiguous, I think, to tie down than they might have been when we first started looking at these things about a decade ago. But with that, I want to switch the focus to talk about privacy dark patterns for a few minutes, because I think that is a great example, exactly, honestly, of this switch. The fact that privacy has become a core issue online, and this wasn't something necessarily that companies, kind of mom and pop stores may have been engaged with 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so it really is, to some extent, I think, a dark pattern of the web versus dark patterns that existed in the physical space and came onto the web, if that makes sense. So Dan, actually, I want to go back to you first, just to say your lab has been working on thinking through consent interfaces now for three or 4 years, I want to say. And I just want to find out from you, what lessons have you learned? What because consent in particular is really tough. Let me just foreground it by saying this. We know that people, as you alluded to earlier, don't have the time. Nobody's going to read terms and conditions. Nobody's going to read privacy policies. And so the kind of expectations that we can get clear, informed consent, that somebody has had the time to think through and understands everything available to them, that's a very potentially high standard for a lot of what we're doing online. So just, can you give me a sense of what you've learned working on this issue?
Yeah, I wish I could do without running off for 50 minutes of vague reflections and
Right.
puzzlements and moments of optimism, moments of cynicism. I think you're right. It is difficult, and I wish I had these are the 5 things we've learned, right? But the first thing I'd say is to that question about how do you balance kind of the very high ideal but also very reasonable goal to say people need to be informed and they need to have accessible information. They need to make meaningful choices online. And on the one hand, you can look at, say, privacy policies and areas like that and say, yeah, it is a big ask of people, right? In urgency. I think the responsibility is to make it readable, right? Is to say that if you're minded to, you can access this information, that it's in a format that is comprehensible to you, that it's written in a way that you can understand, that it's clear and it's comprehensive. And to some degree as well, those kinds of mechanisms are both a user-facing kind of structure to say, this is the kind of contract with you, but it's also an accountability measures to make sure that experts like you and Finn and many others can hold companies to account in the way that we're delightfully often held to account and sometimes painfully. I think the other side of it is across the consent areas, sometimes it is actually not as complex as it seems, right? There are some areas we've experimented with. I remember working with one of your colleagues, Jen, before around the concept of icons and consent. And that's been a very attractive idea for a number of years. I think in GDPR it was described as a potential area of investigation. And we've done some experimentation around that. Can we take advantage of heuristics to give people signals about how they should understand complex kind of data choices? And the results were really dismal, actually. It was very difficult for people to attach icons to different things. And there are moments of frustration with that. But similarly, I think when it comes to designing good consent, fairness is the quality you need. I think you need to work within the constraints that exist of people's time and their attention. You need to make consents clear and unambiguous. You need to represent clear choices to people. And you need to just ask people a question that relates to what they're trying to do and that makes sense to them. So in many ways, the degree to which you simplify that makes the consent more meaningful and more powerful. And we've made many changes and evolutions in our approach to consent, and also improved having consent for things improving consent or breaking it out for things like location data is super sensitive, and we've understood better the risks around that. Or initially facial recognition, we developed and designed a new consent around that experience, and now have deprecated the entire data use. I think that is part of the overall kind of flow and journey that I think there's positive things to see around that. I think what's very difficult is where there's pervasive experiences around cookies that for people don't feel like they add up to very much, but can also represent a set of practices that are important. And how you kind of gather those, but in many ways they're not as much about the individual consent as about the system around them and how you kind of manage it. But as it goes, how do we kind of both respect what users' intent is, respect the fact that they're trying to make use of a service, and that's the context they're often asked for permission within, and then remove complexity and improve simplicity as much as possible, and achieve the greatest degree of kind of clarity and accessibility. And the good news is the kind of tools we have as designers of listening and talking to people, of experimentation and prototyping, are really well suited to helping to do that better. If I were to look across the breadth, I think that the main job now is to spread the good practices as widely as possible and see that across the range of industries, the best knowledge is there. And that's like in our lab, at least, what we're trying to do is kind of share learnings as much as possible and say, this is what we know about how to do data education. This is what we know and we don't know about some of these areas. Here's where we think in this context, you can help someone make a good choice and make things clear to them. Here are the mental models many people bring. But I would say it's not a homogenous experience. Like, not every consent experience is the same. Asking for different things at different times is important. What you're being asked for up front versus in the middle of a service, how much somebody knows, like all of that contributes to either the opportunities or the challenges. But that's a long answer, I'm sure, but I could go on and on.
No, it's a very complicated area. In some senses, I think you can get people to consent to literally anything. So we have to keep that in mind. And I also would imagine, and Finn, I'd like to turn to you next. There are some practices we just wholesale would say people just can't meaningfully consent to, or we need more boundaries around how data is used, for example. Because you may consent at one stage and you don't understand that that data will be there for 5, 10, 15 years. A lot of us do have relationships now with online services that go back over a decade, and that's going to be really hard to grasp. But Finn, I know that you've talked about privacy by design in particular as potentially being a solution, but I'm curious, when we say privacy by design, if there's a particular aspect to that you think is helpful, as well as you have any comments on what Dan just said.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think there's lots of different issues that at play here at the same time, and I think fundamentally we should probably change our view on how we do a lot of things. I think that if companies were to implement a lot of these principles, privacy by design and privacy by default, then you'd have much less situations where you would need to consent in the first place. Because what we do now is we try to get away from all of that by having all these meaningless consent procedures. And just yesterday was a huge decision done in Belgium, where the consent framework, which was used by created by the major advertising organization IAB, was deemed illegal. Obviously, I'm sure this will be challenged in court, but I think it pinpoints a frustration that a lot of consumers have. You get these meaningless cookie consent procedures up. They're confusing, they are misleading, and also if you accept them, your data will be shared with hundreds, potentially thousands of companies. And if you reject them, the data might still be shared. It's a huge, huge problem. So, if the principles of privacy by design, privacy by default, and purpose limitation, so you don't use the data for other purpose than what you state, are respected, a lot of these problems would go away, I think. And I think that, and fundamentally, we also have to just realize that the business models that are prevailing today are based largely on collecting as much data as possible. And I would wish we could change that dynamic, where we could still have digital services, still provide ads without collecting so much data. I think that would prevent a lot of the problems that we're seeing today. We have very data hungry business models. And that's why one of the proposals that we have had is to have a ban on what we call surveillance-based advertising. And I think that would create or take away one of the major incentives of collecting a lot of the data in the first place. And the data that you would collect, you would have to collect in a legitimate way and possibly create ads based on that. And I think that would create a much more transparent field. And I do think companies like Facebook and Meta and Google would be able to still provide ad-driven services. I believe other business models would thrive, such as contextual advertising. You could also have self-reported interest-based ads delivered. But I do think that the enormous amounts of vulnerabilities that can be deducted from all this data that's collected about us can be misused in so many different ways is a huge risk. So I think this data-hungry business models are driving the use of dark patterns. And I really think that we need to create a more level playing field for consumers, because there's a power asymmetry and an information asymmetry here. And I'm not saying that companies should not collect data, but we need to change the equation quite fundamentally. So I think, we're not there today, but I do think we can hopefully get there.
Right. Those are all great points. And I think the information asymmetry one is the one that often resonates with me, because it's just the consumers stand on such different ground with companies that it is seemingly impossible to reconcile under at least our current models. And so, privacy by design, privacy by default is potentially, I think, a way forward if it's written into some form of legislation, such as, let's ask that personal data be deleted by default over some amount of time, for example. Again, I really worry about those long-term relationships and how that data built over time really disadvantages individual consumers. Jane, can you share your thoughts based on what you've heard? I don't know if you've dealt explicitly with privacy by design at all, or if from your perspective, maybe it's not just about quote unquote privacy by design, but particular kind of industry-wide standards that you think need to be in place. We'd love to hear from you.
No, and I think the privacy by design, it's also kind of security by design. I think it goes much wider than that, and that we can learn actually from other methods. I mean, I think your point, Jennifer, is really important about the longer the relationship goes on and data is just kept for long periods. So just even in a pre kind of social media world where documents had retention periods, we can use and learn from that, so that by default things only last for a certain amount of time. You always, I think, need to give the option for those retention periods, as it were, to be extended. And I think there can be, you can still, I think there is a concern of those, you're right, where we're a data driven, and a lot of the people on the commercial side or companies doing this say, I want as much data as I can, and you ask, what do you want it for? And they say, we don't know yet, but we just need it just in case we need it in future. And a lot of that, by a privacy by design, you can say, we're really happy for you to have a mesh which collects all of this data, but why don't you aggregate it all now? Do you know what I mean? To do contextualized advertising. So you can see how many people are likely to travel to Silicon Valley in January or February, but you don't need to know who travels. You need to know the idea of that. And perhaps using a privacy by design and learning from a security, because the other issue we have in the industry is the longer you keep information, the greater the security risk. You have a bigger risk of identity theft, of other matters like that. So I think this is going beyond cookies, but we want to try and create a culture where it doesn't need to necessarily be personalized. It could be aggregated, contextual, and that could also have values, and to look into those as well.
Great, thank you so much. I want to take a quick detour now to talk about kind of where we are with dark patterns in terms of kind of how we understand how they work. Dan, I'm going to start with you. You and I have similar educational backgrounds, so I know we both looked at the research. My read is that there's not a lot of research that really tries to grapple with how dark patterns work. There's been a lot of descriptive research to figure out that they're there and trying to name them, which obviously is a great first step. Although I think Finn mentioned, and I think Finn, you've probably heard this from complaints to your organization in particular, or some of the studies you've even done. People do tend to feel very tricked, upset, concerned when these things happen, when they feel like they've been taken in by a dark pattern. But anyway, could you give us a quick read on kind of where you think the research is right now in terms of understanding it, and what do we need to do in this area in particular? And we'll just frame that by saying, the types of kind of experimental studies or observational studies to understand dark patterns can be really hard to do. Easier to do within a large company, hard to do, I will say, even speaking from myself on the outside as an academic, especially if you don't have funding or the current funding apparatus doesn't actually reward that type of research, which is often what I've found to be the case in the US. So with that, please take it away.
Thanks, Dan. And just kind of levering off, I think, some of the points that Finn and Jane made. Like, I think the role for privacy by design is really important, and there's definitely significant improvements we can do in like being more precise and narrower in how we kind of collect data and provide services to people. But I would note, like, these are services that the material they're driven on often is data. You know, and especially if you're a social network, you know, the posts you're providing, the choices you're making around that, how you organize a news feed, like these are important, not just for the business model kind of questions, but I actually provide a service. And my experience has told me, actually, I don't think we give up on transparency and control as important measures. No matter what the paradigm shifts toward, no matter what the evolutions are, those are going to be important. And there's new technologies like PETs. I saw a question in the chat just a moment ago, actually, and I was thinking the same thing. Like, what about technologies that allow us to like provide the same levels of fidelity of service, the same levels of analysis, but while protecting people's privacy in a verifiable way? Those are really high potential. You know, there are ways to provide many of the same values and protect people's privacy, and investment and incentives to kind of go in those directions are really important. To the same point, right? So talking about the research, I think what we've got to try to understand here is what is the voice of consumers in this kind of debate as well. Because while in many of these areas, like rightly so, it's very driven by groups of experts, groups like this kind of gathering together and considering the kinds of range of harms. I think you've got to reconcile it as well with like people's day-to-day use of services, the value they provide to them, the usefulness, and also what are the factors that they find annoying. And the good news is, I think that the intent and the goals of digital services are very well aligned, actually, with providing for trust, providing meaningful experiences, providing controls that are meaningful, providing clear information to people in those different areas. I think like one of the questions is from the empirical work is, you know, what are the perceived harms? What are the negative experiences I have on my services? Where am I really frustrated? Lior Strahilovitz's and with apologies where I'm butchering someone's surname, pretty enough the first time this week, work around that area was quite novel, and I think it's interesting by virtue of the fact that it's one of the unique pieces of empirical work talking to people about saying, here is a potential experience you have, here's an online experience you might have, a pattern you might meet. Like, what did you find that was good or bad about this? How would you rate this on a level of kind of like frustration? What would you prefer? And I think on the one hand, what it's showing us is like there are bad patterns that are there. There are many areas for improvement, but also people do want a kind of a guided experience in many areas. I don't know that it's necessarily the way to say this is totally hands off, and it's time for services to say, like, my job is to step away from the kind of online questions that you have. I think the goal I would pursue is fairness. Like, how do you provide digital experiences, and in those important moments especially, set the right boundaries, the right safeguards, avoid unfair practices. Avoid practices that people look at and say, this is me being treated not with respect as a user, as a consumer. I'm uncertain, I'm insecure, I'm not sure what I'm being asked. Those are toxic both to brands and the relationship, and also toxic, I think, it's just in the basic name of kind of like responsible use of.
Finn, I want to turn to you on this. I'm sorry, Dan, are you?
Sorry, no, I think I'll hand over.
Okay. Sorry if I interrupted you. Finn, so I have 2 points I want to ask you on this. One is, what harms have you observed, I guess, and kind of what would you articulate as being kind of the biggest concern to you? And I think also relatedly, we've all talked about whether digital literacy is an answer. I'm potentially very skeptical that you can train people to necessarily spot these. And I would also argue it's not the burden. This shouldn't be the model, because we shouldn't have to train people to recognize dark patterns the same way I often find in the privacy space, having to say, well, you need to install 3 different browser extensions and kind of conduct your life this way, to me is not the optimal answer for how do you deal with privacy online. So I think maybe a word from you about the harms you've seen, and If you have particular communities that you are concerned with, because I think we talk a lot, Dan's mentioned fairness a lot, but fairness doesn't precisely mean giving everybody maybe the exact same interface per se. Or, where do we need to think more about particular communities that are more vulnerable to these things?
Yeah, good questions. I think the harms will vary a lot. But I do think, and I think the research that Dan quoted also show that certain groups are more vulnerable than others, especially groups with lower levels of education. However, I think that, and that of course can make the impact much larger. And if you combine that with, let's say, targeted messages, targeted advertising towards those groups that are embedded with dark patterns, for example, based on their vulnerabilities, whether that is you're vulnerable to gambling, or you're vulnerable to taking up high payday loans, or you're in a difficult financial situation, or you're very insecure about your looks and you're targeted with plastic surgery ads, or you're worried about your body and you're getting ads for body improvements or muscle enhancement. I mean, these are real life examples of ads that targeted at vulnerable groups today, or vulnerable people in vulnerable situations, because when you can profile users in the way that we can today, to the level of identifying vulnerabilities, and whether that is the things I just mentioned or other things, you can really tailor messages towards those groups and exploit those vulnerabilities. And we all have vulnerabilities. When you time those messages at a time when you are more susceptible, which of course, again, you can calculate when you can do these types of approaches on scale, and you can do A/B testing in real time and see what messages work and which don't work. You can perfect this in a digital ecosystem. So then suddenly we're all vulnerable to these types of dark patterns and manipulative attempts on our. I think the harms can be massive. It could be that you're deprived of your privacy, you're discriminated against in ads, or you are being targeted for exploitation in different ways. So I think that this is a potentially very serious issue. And one of the challenges with getting testimonials, I often speak to school children and students and all kinds of groups. And I ask them, have you been manipulated? And they say, no, I'm not manipulated. And then they are, but I know people who've been manipulated. And I think that's very telling, because it's not easy to know if you're manipulated. That's sort of the nature of manipulation. Because if you knew you were being manipulated, you weren't being manipulated. So that's like, there's a catch-22 there. But if you describe certain situations, have you ever felt forced to make a decision? Have you ever felt stressed? Did you ever find it hard to get out of a subscription? Then people start thinking about it, and you're getting feedback on this. So I think we should definitely do more research in this field. But we shouldn't wait for 10-year study to see the impact of a lot of these dark patterns. Some of them are very obvious and should just be ended. So that was the issue of sort of harms. It's a huge range here. Individual harm, you have societal harm, right? Where you might be tricked into giving up your face in a face recognition software. The harm won't be done to you, maybe, but the algorithm might be used to discriminate other groups in the future using that kind of software. So you have societal harms based on individual choices as a result of dark patterns as well, just to give you one example. So I think digital literacy, for sure, we should definitely all work on having better digital literacy. I think that should happen in school. It should happen with teachers, with decision makers, everywhere. But that cannot be the fix for this problem, because this is a systemic problem, where also I think from a company perspective, we need to create a more level playing field, because some of the worst actors are getting away with murder and not being, literally speaking, of course, no, literally, figuratively speaking, sorry, getting away with doing quite a lot and not be getting penalized for it. And I'm being approached by companies and saying, we would like to do better. And designers have contacted me and said, we want to do better, but all our competitors are using these bad practices. So if you can just raise the bar, it will be better for everyone. So this is why I think there's a very good business argument for regulating this in a better way than we're doing today. I don't know if that was an answer to your question. Sorry.
No, it was. And actually, you just read into what I was going to ask Jane, which Jane, I see in privacy a race to the bottom, in the sense that in the US, at least, where we have very little privacy law or very few privacy regulations, you really, I consider it a race to the bottom in terms of businesses that don't engage in some of the same tactics as their competitors will just find they're at a disadvantage. So we've talked a lot about the consumer today, but I was just wondering if you could weigh in for a moment on kind of what the business to business harm is when this happens.
And that's exactly it. And it's a really interesting discussion within a business, because genuinely some businesses want to do right. Do you know what I mean? And their problem is, do I race to the bottom because I've got a finance department saying my competitors are doing that, therefore I want to do that. But actually we are finding in business, particularly it can be a selling point as well, you know, a value of, we are a European-based company. We use European standards and we like to impose those rights globally. You know, that is easier to have a global product, but they consider, often the company consider the trust of their consumers to be really, really important. So, but I think it's an internal wrangle, but I think it can be, and it takes persuading internally to have a company where you have a ethical side that says, we think our value will be greater raised by being good, by doing good. And that helps with the kind of ESG feeling going forward, that enforces our brand. It makes us better if we're seen to be trying to be transparent and fair. But I think there is always that little nagging doubt in the end, but my competitors are doing this and why can't I?
Right. Keeping an eye on the clock, and we're going to switch to audience questions very shortly, but let's delve into one last topic before we do, which is just talking about regulation. So obviously there's a lot of different dimensions to this problem. I would say that a one-size-fits-all regulation is probably not the answer, both because we have different industries, different contexts, and just a different range of dark patterns. And so, but we do need to figure out a way forward. So Finn, I would like to start with you. I'm just curious if you have kind of a goal of how you'd like to see regulators proceed. You know, if there's specific practices you want to see banned. I have been wondering about at these different decision points that consumers make, like e-commerce checkouts. You know, do we need to have standards, for example, at those points where everybody, in terms of fairness, was fairness meaning everybody sees the same checkout, everybody sees the same prices, or do we account for different kind of vulnerabilities potentially in how we equate fairness? Anyway, there's obviously a lot of questions, and I'm just curious, what's top of mind for you on the regulatory front?
Yeah, no, I'm sure. No, I think you can definitely do lots of design that are adapted to different groups. I think, you know, good user design is also desirable, right? So we can distinguish between sort of, you know, good user design where, let's say, it's clearly in the interest of the consumer that you design the button in such a way. You know, I think we should still do that. But I think it's pretty obvious that in questions relating to your financial, you know, situation. So we haven't talked much about that today, and it's not the scope of the conversation. But it's clear that if you're basically, it's impossible to leave a subscription. It's super easy to sign up to one, but it's impossible to leave one. That's not something that should be okay. So, you know, you can have a principle-based approach to certain things. Let's say it should be as easy to leave a service as to join a service. That's really intuitive and easy for consumers to understand. Obviously, there will always be gray zones, right? So it doesn't, but it's pretty obvious. Like, we filed a complaint against Amazon last year. I'll link to it in the chat, where we basically mapped out how easy it was to sign up for Amazon Prime. It was like 2 steps. So I'm putting it very simply now. So if there are Amazon people in the room, don't sue me because I'm misrepresenting it. But basically, it was like 2 steps to sign up, and you're part of Prime. And coming out of it was 10 to 15 to 20 steps, you know, depending on how you clicked. And they used a series of dark patterns to dissuade you from signing up. And most people would think they had already signed out, and they hadn't. So, you know, I think we need a principle-based approach that is kind of future-proof. But I think also there's room for specific bans of certain types of practices. But if you only do a ban of certain practices, there will always be new bans, right? There will always new things that come up, and you can never sort of future-proof it. So I think a holistic approach to dark patterns, manipulative designs, deceptive tactics, you might need to do this through consumer law, supplemented by data protection law. You have also Digital Services Act in the European Union, which you can use to a certain extent. There's a proposal in there now. We'll see if that will stay there or not. But it also needs to be supplemented by additional measures. So you could have, we can reduce, you also need to look at competition policy, right? So you need to have a place to go if you're unhappy with a service. So consumers need to vote with their feet. So competition policy, I think, is important additional measure. And also look at portability and interoperability rules so that actually consumers can vote with their feet if they discover a dark pattern and are happy with the service. I think one of the problems is that a lot of companies have a de facto monopoly within their category, and it's hard to leave regardless because all your friends are on that platform or all the services are on that platform. And if you go somewhere else because of network effects and other things, you're not able to use your consumer power. So I think, you have to look at this from a holistic level. And I do think, and I want to add just to what we talked about previously, I do think that there's a huge business incentive in addition to doing that. I do think consumers get really frustrated when they're sort of tricked. So I do think that there should be an argument made that treating your customers with respect, building that trust. I think also then actually consumers will give up more data as long as they know and they can trust that the data is not misused in any way. So hopefully that we will get, and we also can then get a lot of these good services that are data intensive, right? Let's say within health, within other areas. So yeah. We need to look at this from a big approach, and I'm hoping that we can create laws in Europe and in the US, because then, in particular, because that's where a lot of the companies are based today, but also in other parts of the world as the digital services arise. So that's why it's so great with so many people from all over the world participating here today. I realized we have like 20, 25 countries on this seminar, so that's fantastic.
Well, your response kind of, I think, highlights to me just how much only focusing on kind of one aspect of the problem won't be enough. It's a very complex, multi-layered issue that's not just about the interface, but kind of intertwined with all of these different business practices as well. And that makes it obviously really hard. Dan, I want to turn to you next because we do have in Europe, you globally, the Digital Service Act was introduced with a specific dark patterns amendment, I think might be the right term. And that we've looked at that. And so the questions I have for you on that are, it's an interesting example because it goes into some kind of, I would call specific design guidelines. They mention visual prominence, the idea that something visually stands out to you. Just to give an example for the audience, I think a common one will be if you have two buttons placed before you, the one that wants you to do something like consent or agree, it's bigger and green or blue, and the other button is grayed out and smaller and less prominent. How something is designed will affect the decision-making choice you go, and it's obviously more attractive, more visible to you to pick the big bright green button or the big bright blue button. Also questions of, could we have neutral design? This is something I've wondered about as well. What does it mean to have neutral design? In those decision points that we've mentioned a few times, for example, are those places where we should say, hey, you shouldn't have persuasive design. But what that means in practice, I think, is a really open question. So just to say, when it comes to legislation and actual kind of prescriptive design recommendations, where do you fall on that? Do you think that is helpful? Do you think there are areas where we need those? Or do you think that we'll run into the issue of it quickly becoming obsolete, potentially, which I think is always a concern when you look at older design guidelines, at least here in the US. I can look at what the Federal Trade Commission released back in the year 2000, and you look at those examples, and of course, they're hopelessly out of date at this point.
Yeah, I share some of those concerns. I think, like, speaking to the overall topic and kind of going back to the research question, right? For me, there are actually a couple of pretty consensus-driven and clear practices that shouldn't persist, right? Where we can actually tell pretty clearly, like this is just frustrating a user's intent, and we're making it deliberately hard for people to achieve what they're trying to do, and broadly, like setting it like a common playing field, like Jane, what you spoke about, and eliminating those practices is in common interest. And I'm really keen to kind of like solve some of these problems. I do worry about the potential kind of negative externalities where we have very prescriptive guidance in how an interface should be designed, that it's very difficult for that to kind of like keep up with evolving UX trends, and also potentially to see kind of like whether is the kind of ultimate victim of some of that a worse experience for people. The kind of history in some respects of how like people engage with legal standards around interfaces is not covered in glory, right? We haven't seen loads of like massive improvements driven by distinct standards. I think what we have seen improvements in have been where industries set a common guideline to eliminate bad practices. And for me, there's actually a very clear incentive. There was a good piece of research we published on the TTC Lab site. It was actually reflecting on how bad privacy experiences from one company reflect poorly on the lot. So if I have a bad experience on one digital service, it gives me like a negative experience across the breadth. It really reduces trust. And I think that's actually a really compelling reason to say, folks, we need to hold bad actors to account. We need to eliminate the worst practices. And eliminating the worst practices shouldn't be at the expense of tackling some of the broad and complex and frankly might be difficult challenges across the breadth of the experiences. I think it's really important that there's consistency between the different kinds of standards and regulations. And I would say that like Europe has both a number of different existing laws that companies are grappling with, and again, both positive and sometimes challenging ways of interpreting like what does it mean to design a consent that is freely given, informed, that's clear. What does that look like? And indeed, how can I design that consistently across different surfaces and in different contexts? It isn't trivial in its own right. I think there's lots of space to do better, without a doubt. But I would be very wary of introducing other different standards that describe different language, or that are maybe in tension. And secondly, I would look at some of the specific examples, right? I think where you have, say, an opt-out experience that frustrates somebody, that forces them to make a phone call to go away from, like, I signed up online and I have to ring somewhere, those are areas that we could stand to do a lot better. But take that example, Finn, that you described, right, of saying it should be no more difficult to unsign up than it is to sign up. What if I've signed up for a photo sharing service and I can sign up in 2 clicks. Those are things that are usually generally good, right? Low friction, easy sign up. You shouldn't understand the consequences of that choice. But if I've got like data stored at that service, how do I communicate to somebody like the consequences of deleting my account, where it goes? Where is there a good friction that I might introduce that helps somebody explore that? Or what if I have data from within the service that says, this is an experience people regret, and I have emails from people afterwards saying, I deleted my account by accident. Those are, and I don't say this in a self-interest way, those are genuine concerns. Like, they're part of the matrix of considerations. And for me, that's an area where you need a bit of nuance and flexibility to treat people. I think fairness is the key consideration. And I take that across that question about neutrality, Jennifer, as well. When it comes to lots of those experiences online, there are legitimate marketing activities. There's ways companies can say, this is what I'm offering you as a service. This is what you're trying to achieve in your digital journey. And you can make a proposition. And I think you do that within clear bounds that eliminate bad practices that treat people unfairly. That should be consensus driven. That should be potentially supported in regulation in many areas. That eliminate things like, nagging, where I'm asking to like revisit a choice, eliminate things like double negatives, that eliminate things like, forced timing and action that just don't have a place in those areas, that combine things that like don't make sense in terms of data usages. But with that said, there's also areas where, you might have to do some kind of bundling, for instance, of data use. Who should decide on how that works? What is the mental model a user has? How much language does somebody want to deal with in that situation? All on the way to maybe using an app to book a bus service or sign up for a gig, and like reducing friction in those areas is actually really helpful and makes things more accessible and easier for people as well. So I think it's an area where like we should avoid demonstrative action. We should achieve consistency, coherence, And we should, at the very outset, start with the harms, identify the things that are the worst experiences for people, that hit them in their pockets, that leave them frustrated, that treat them with disrespect, and focus in those areas and not ignore them at the expense or with the pursuit of eliminating all of the set of practices, even if that's well intended, at the consequence of potentially worse experiences for people online.
Thank you, Dan. Jane, do you have any last words before we move on to audience questions on regulation or any other aspect of this discussion?
On that, I couldn't agree more, Dan. I mean, I think common standards is what you want. From a business perspective, when they're looking at products or looking to encourage their end consumer to do it, they need to be able to compare one with another. The question is how does this work? You know, what will be the impact? Can I trust this? Is it fair? And until we have that, and I think the consumer has a very hard thing. They are one of many, many, many. And maybe this is where businesses can actually force that I want to be offering fair services, so I need to be able to understand how it works. And this goes more than the dark patterns in the whole algorithms. Do you know what I mean? Nobody's going to ask you to give the very deep technical information, but there has to be a common standard where somebody says, I understand enough about how this works to be able to want to recommend it or encourage it. So I think it needs to be a bit of common standards that people can compare one with another. Yes.
Thank you. So let's, I think we have about 19 minutes left, maybe. Let's move to some questions. Stuart, did you want to jump in on any? Because if you don't, there's a couple in here I've already identified that we can take. But let me hear from you for a second first.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I have about 10 questions. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I've identified about 10 questions, probably more, but first one's really an observation from Noura Al-Materi, who says, shouldn't we call these things profit patterns rather than dark patterns? I think this is an observation. I'm not suggesting we discuss this, but I think the term dark patterns is so well established. We can think of it as profit patterns as an underlying concept, but I don't think, my perspective, I wouldn't change the term. Moving on quickly to Ashley Winton's questions. To what extent should dark patterns be tackled by consumer law as well as data protection law? And that's a real solid question. Does anyone have a view on that?
Jane, as a lawyer, do you have a first take on that one?
Sorry, Stuart, could you just repeat?
Yes, yes. This is quite the question from Ashley Winton. To what extent should dark patterns be tackled by consumer law as well as data protection law?
I think we should come at it from a lot of different ways. I mean, I think consumer protection law is always there, as the word says, to protect the consumer. Data protection law, I am the biggest fan of the GDPR, because what I think it did and moved away from is it made a flexible framework, which I think is very important to future-proof things, that you put in appropriate controls, that you try and put in privacy by design and by default, and you can justify that. But I think there's also an area from a kind of business to business for competition law of and that would be another way to do it. So I don't think a one size fits all for everything. I think we should use as many of the tools as we can in our toolbox for that.
Yes, and Finn, in your answers to questions, did refer to your action against Amazon under consumer law recently to deal with some of these issues. And I should point out, in the UK, there's been formal link between the Information Commission's Office, the ICO, and the Consumer Competition and Markets Authority and other financial regulators to try and tackle many of these issues from several angles. And I know there's been contacts between BEOC, the European Consumer Organization, and the European Data Protection Board, and so on. So their regulators are getting together. So I suppose, as you say, Jane, the issues can be tackled from several different angles at once.
But I think another thing Stuart, just to bring on that, is, you know, how we've all seen businesses in particular sit back and take notice because of the enormous fines that you can have under GDPR. I mean, there is nothing to get a business saying the reason you can't do this is it will subject us potentially to 4% of our global annual turnover. Okay, so you go and talk to your ExCom member and say that the fine is going to be £20 million and come back and say if he thinks that's a risk you're prepared to take. So
Yes.
that is
Yeah,
very helpful.
And I can just add to that. And I mean, I talked about law in my previous previous comment, but I you know, also we need to look at remedies and within consumer law and effective enforcement mechanisms. I mean, it is a challenge that enforcement is pretty slow in all these areas, and under consumer law, still, I think there's the mechanisms for ensuring compliance are too weak in Europe. I mean, speaking from my experience, and you know, it's also a problem that, I mean, without being disrespectful of anyone here, and I don't actually have a complaint. We haven't filed any formal complaints against Facebook. We have against Google and Amazon, even though we have identified a few dark patterns with Facebook as well. Companies tend to fight this out with lengthy delays in court systems, and I understand that companies will have to defend their own interests, but we also have to come to the acknowledgement that then maybe the interests are fundamentally at times competing. So we need to just draw the line somewhere. So I would have wished that we could have had swifter mechanisms for compliance.
Okay. Also in the States, Jennifer, wouldn't it be true to say that Consumer Reports, the consumer advocacy group, has got quite involved in privacy issues and dark patterns as well? So they as an advocacy group, they're quite working on this as well.
Yes, definitely.
They've tested websites and they've taken actions forward. So is this the situation improving in California? You've now got this sort of law, quite strong, the strongest privacy law in the States, California, and many tech companies are based in California. So is there a change in the environment for companies in California, at least, which may then roll over and influence other states in the US?
That is a good question. You know, certainly companies have those links up, do not sell my personal information. We could debate whether they're visually prominent enough that people see them. I did my own research on the process by which people execute those rights and found very mixed results, things I call dark patterns. And I filed comments with this with our state attorney general. You know, I guess my overwhelming critique would be that the first California law did not change things substantively for consumers in their everyday experiences. I think it probably has done more on the back end to make businesses, as Jane has described, take notice and begin to do things like inventory what data they had, you know, to really understand kind of what they, you know, what were they sitting on top of. But in terms of dark patterns, I'm not sure. I mean, I think after I filed those comments and there's been some public discussion that maybe some companies have tried to rethink the actual mechanism by which you can opt out of sales of your personal information. The next new California law that will go into effect in 2023 has more specific guidance on consent and dark patterns. And that is what I think might be an interesting game changer, depending on what our new state agency decides to do. I have a whole paper on this topic because I think that, you know, they could stop and take a look at the consent processes right now, and like the bundled consents that I showed you at the top of our presentation, and ask the question as to whether, like, is this really sufficient? That said, what I argue in my paper is that, you know, unbundling those things and making people stop and have to go through all these things independently, to me, is not a good solution. And I think that's one of my biggest concerns in the dark pattern space is that, you know, I think that regulators could take this very, I guess, narrow view of how to make these things better and end up making the user experience worse, because suddenly it's like, oh, I want to make sure that you've actually read the privacy policy. So now I'm going to require that businesses show you the whole thing, and you got to page through it and you got to check a box, which to me is not an improvement at all.
Right.
And it does speak to one of the questions in the chat. privacy enhancing technologies, I do think there are ways forward with privacy enhancing technologies, but I'll leave that there unless in case we want to go to some other questions.
Yeah, we've got some other questions. Yeah, so the European Parliament does speak specifically about avoiding repetitive consent. So that relates to your point. Anyway, moving on to the next question. Does Peter Sykes is asking, in what circumstances are dark patterns used by national or local government? So we've been talking here all about companies, but is there any evidence that public sector organizations use dark patterns? I'm not familiar with such examples, but then maybe they exist.
I can say something on that point quickly, which is I don't know if we see governments necessarily engaging in quote unquote dark patterns as much as what I might call hostile design. And we've alluded to this a few times, just bad design in terms of you inadvertently create dark patterns because you haven't actually you don't have the people on staff to do the kind of user experience and design work that today I think is absolutely necessary. It might have been a decade ago, you could have public government designing websites on their own without anybody kind of weighing in on those issues. And at this point, I'd say we're long past that point. But I think it's been a really uphill battle, I will say, here in the US, and I assume also in the EU, to get governments to create those jobs and to hire and recruit the people, the technologists broadly, that you need, that expertise in public government. And there may be cases where I would say in the US, I think we've had instances for public benefits in states that tend to skew towards not wanting to offer public benefits to people, hostile design, where they've made it really hard. And sometimes I think that's accidental. Sometimes I think it might be purposeful. Unfortunately, I have a sense it might be more widespread here in the US, but maybe other panelists have an opinion on that one.
Yeah, well, we've got several more questions. So certainly, I like the idea of hostile. I like the idea. I mean, it's a term I haven't heard of before, hostile design. So that's a new one to add to the lexicon. This leads on to your next one, which you have answered in the chat, but in the question answers, but I think we should put it as a verbal question. So if someone sees dark patterns, who can they report them to? I think in Europe, we can say the national data protection authorities or the national consumer organizations, but maybe the panel have other ideas. And Jen, you did put something in the questions and answers. You're running a website for people to complain to.
Yes, that's the Dark Patterns tip line, which is just darkpatternstipline.org. It's a site that my colleagues at Stanford and I have taken over as of January, and we are building that out as a resource. Not as much as there's some questions in the chat about educational resources, and I apologize. Finn may have a better idea right now as to where consumers can go to read about dark patterns in much more less academic friendly areas. Our site right now is certainly, if you look at it, you can learn and you can report about dark patterns, but it is not a deep consumer kind of expertise site at this point that really helps you learn more about them. But you can at least see some examples and obviously submit any that you may have.
Right. Okay. Has any member of the panel got examples of where dark patterns are explained in simple terms for people with educational challenges or other vulnerabilities, like not the academic end of the spectrum, but simple consumer communications?
This might not be the best place to educate people, but there are definitely threads on Reddit that are pretty educational because they're full of very specific examples. So there's a dark patterns thread on Reddit where if you go there, you'll see people reporting dark patterns en masse as well. So if you go there, I mean, it's a bit like it when you see it kind of thing, right? With lots of dark patterns. But no, sadly, there aren't enough good resources available for consumers either to learn about it. But it's not it's not one of those things that you need to know about. So I think education need to happen through I don't know, different ways, but of course better online resources so that people who are interested above average could find out more about it. That would be super helpful. So the dark patterns tip line is actually something I use as well, so it's a very good first step, I think.
Okay, so Jen, you take reports from anywhere around the world. It's not just US. Okay, so all comments from.
One more to add is Harry Brignall's website, who coined the phrase darkpatterns.org, I think it is, and there's a Twitter account, and very easy to just tag them into a Twitter. And I think just like Finn said, you look at them and know them when you see them, and going through some examples and reflecting on the breadth of kind of practices is a really good way to build knowledge.
Okay, so Dan and Finn and Jen, please send me those links and I'll put them in the follow-up email. So that'd be great. I didn't mean to do that. Sorry.
Just one angle, just from for people kind of designing things that we've come across is rather than when you see it in a dark pattern, particularly the ICO have done some amazing work on the kind of child appropriate design and some of their sandbox work, which although it's not directly related to this, a lot of the lessons of good practice from design can be used to try where people say, I want to develop something good as kind of guidelines, which we found very useful.
Right. Yes. One person put in a question about we should think not only of trust but also respect. Companies should respect their customers, and the rhetorical thing from Chad Woolen is respect the new trust. One particular question to Dan was how do we all persuade companies we're involved in to balance the desire? This is at the core of the issue, really, to finish off with. Grand finale. How do we achieve balance between a company's desire to take as much data as possible and then giving individuals a real choice over the data they give to companies? This is like a sort of concluding round, I think, because we have about 3 minutes left or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think to some degree the kind of idea of like a totally unthoughtful view to suck in as much data is not actually reflective of the practices, and indeed like it's not how the systems work generally. I think as well, just as Jane said earlier, companies are being much more reflective about actually like data both as a kind of potential way to offer services or provide a digital experience, and also as a risk, as something to be managed carefully, protected, areas that require like important practices around governance, around transparency, around deletion, around controls that they offer to people. I think the questions are like reflecting the kind of norms and expectations better, and like Chad said, practicing respect and fairness in how you kind of engage with people about their data. Because I think where people have bad experiences, it's when it's an unexpected experience. It's when I'm being asked for information that I don't understand. It's out of context. It's a question at the wrong time in a way that I can't engage with. It's an experience that returns information to me. And I think like Meta is critiqued often for having complex controls that reflect, I think, that the complex kind of balances of things like how you post and share information, the social kind of aspects of the service and controls over that, as well as controls over content and posting, as well as the digital services we offer and the way people engage around things like personalization, whether it's in the ads and their posts and things. And that does create like sometimes on the one hand an array of controls that is hard to grok fully. And then also for some people, it's ones that they understand very well over years of using the service, and people have very nuanced senses of like how they're posting and how they're controlling their settings and how they're doing that. And that is the strength of, I think, the transparency and control mechanisms, while also saying the overall ethos has to shift more toward fairness, has to shift more toward respect, has to shift more toward, and I think with it, the core principles around data minimization and the core principles around privacy by design.
Yes, I think many companies are hiring more user experience people. The fact that Facebook/Meta has hired you, Dan, and doing all your work and set up this lab shows that your company is seriously interested in tackling this issue, I think, seems to me. Anyone else have any final comments on this question of the balance between the desire for profit against treating people fairly?
I think just to conclude, I think that's a very good point, and I do, as I mentioned earlier, I think we just at some point we just need to draw the line about what is okay and what's not okay. We actually do need to ban certain practices because the risk is outweighs the benefits, and that will create a more equitable space to work on, where there would be a better balance of power, a better balance of information. I think we need to move away from the sort of free-for-all use of data, because that is happening today. Even if we have rules that regulate the use of data, we actually don't have rules that regulate it good and well enough. So that could be banning on certain types of advertising to reduce the need for collecting data. Could be not that can be other types of use that we need to look at. So I think we can do that and also look at dark patterns holistically. I think we're getting there, because I think what we all want is to have a safer and a better internet online, so that we can use the benefits. But we do need to address these serious challenges that we have as well.
Jane, do you have any final thoughts?
No, it's been a really enjoyable session. Thank you very much, Stuart, and Dan, Finn, and Jennifer. I think we have covered everything that we could possibly have wanted to cover, but we could talk for hours, I'm sure.
Jennifer, do you want any final comments before I wind up?
Nah, good. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, okay, in that case, certainly like to thank you, Professor Jennifer, as our moderator, bringing out many salient issues, which has been working very, very well. Good interactive discussion, all points were represented. Dan for hosting, Jane and Finn for contributing from various sides, and of course, all the audience for joining us from all over the world. The video of this session will be available soon after the session has ended, and we welcome your feedback and ideas for future online events. Our next scheduled webinar, also sponsored by Meta, will take place on Wednesday, 16th of March, when the subject will be helping young people to better protect their privacy and safety online. So moving on to our annual conference, the dates for Winds of Change, our Privacy Laws and Business 35th Anniversary International Conference, the 4th to 6th of July at St John's College, Cambridge. And we look forward to meeting you there in person and online. We'll be doing a hybrid event this year. Registration will be open soon. Let us know if you want to propose a session, be a speaker, or become a sponsor. And we look forward to keeping in contact with all of you via our news, UK and international reports, events and podcasts. And I will say that we have reported this Belgian case that you mentioned, Finn mentioned, in our report, our 35th anniversary international report, to be published tomorrow. So that's all for now. Thanks again very much to all our speakers for preparing very well and energetically discussing the issues, and to you, our audience. And that's it for now. Goodbye.